He was celebrated as a symbol of serenity and purity, but behind that calm that captivated millions lay the first sign of a tragedy that no one wanted to recognize. It was an image that seemed immovable. The industry, the public, and even those who had barely seen him in a brief interview coincided in that his presence radiated an almost sacred softness, a stillness that acted as a refuge in an environment marked by speed, pressure, and endless expectations. However, behind that face that so many considered unalterable, an invisible line began to be drawn, a presage that no one dared to interpret in its true magnitude. The figure of Yu Menglong had been built from contained gestures, serene gazes, and a courtesy that seemed to sustain him in the midst of any tempest. What few knew was that that very serenity was beginning to transform into a vulnerable territory where the most fragile tensions could grow unseen. His trajectory had been erected upon a combination of discipline and sensitivity, a mix uncommon in a world that celebrates immediate greatness and punishes any show of doubt. Every step he took on the screen was accompanied by an aura of balance that invited one to trust him. Therefore, the inevitable question emerged with force: how can an image so solid crack without anyone perceiving the magnitude of the initial blow? Behind every eulogy, behind every carefully pronounced greeting, silent mechanisms began to appear that the industry rarely exposes and which, nevertheless, determine the course of those who depend on its gaze. The shine surrounding Manglong seemed impenetrable, but it was precisely that shine that hid the fragility that would soon be put to the test by circumstances that did not arise from his behavior, but from the speed with which public perception can transform. There, on the diffuse border between admiration and suspicion, the nucleus of a crisis began to form that would expand with unexpected intensity. The story that seemed destined to grow under the protection of a warm and respected figure was about to enter a territory where nothing is completely certain and where the protagonist's voice can be overshadowed with unsettling ease. But behind the glamour and the excuses, what mechanisms really drive this crisis? We will analyze every detail, from the initial errors to the irreversible damages, to see how the entertainment world works and how an icon is redefined. The light that accompanied him from his first steps was beginning to flicker, and in that oscillation lay the key to understanding not only his destiny, but also the deep dynamics of a system that, on many occasions, reacts before understanding. Yu Menglong's story began long before the industry placed upon his shoulders a shine he never requested. His childhood, marked by a silent daily life and a horizon limited by a lack of privileges, molded a sensitivity that would contrast forcefully with the implacable rhythm of professional entertainment. In those initial years, every day resembled the one before. However, Manglong developed an intimate conviction that discipline had the power to open paths that seemed reserved for others. He grew up without influential names backing his arrival in the artistic world, without contacts capable of opening doors for him, nor social networks that amplified his presence. His desire to dedicate himself to acting was born as an impulse for meaning, more spiritual than ambitious. An act of personal searching in the midst of an environment that rarely favored such complex dreams. When he finally managed to enter the professional sphere, he did not take long to attract attention. His way of listening, deliberate and respectful, distinguished him from the habitual urgency of young performers. He observed every direction as if it were a discreet ceremony, absorbed the energy of the studio, memorized the names of those who made up the technical team, and maintained a courtesy that many considered unusual. Directors and colleagues described his presence as a point of harmony in a space saturated with tensions. He did not need to raise his voice or occupy the center of attention. His silence was sufficient to transmit an emotional depth that was rarely found in emerging talents. But within that quality also lay the root of a vulnerability that no one then knew how to recognize. In a system that combines merit with implicit connections, his serene distance began to be perceived as an obstacle. Although he accepted invitations when they responded to a clear professional purpose, He avoided late gatherings, informal dinners that did not pursue a concrete artistic goal, or conversations that seemed designed to measure his willingness to adapt to the sector's unwritten codes. He never showed himself to be haughty. His behavior responded to a constant attempt to keep intact an inner coherence that he considered indispensable to preserve his identity. However, in an environment governed by quick perceptions, that very coherence began to be interpreted as disinterest. The silent structures of the industry operate on planes where decisions are rarely communicated openly. A gesture can become an argument, a supposition a barrier, a misinterpreted phrase a persistent obstacle. For Manglong, the first indications of what was to come were almost imperceptible. A script that was supposed to arrive immediately took weeks to materialize. A project that seemed assured was postponed without visible reason. A director who had shown enthusiasm for working with him suddenly leaned toward another option, without offering an explanation. On the surface, these were common circumstances, but the accumulation of these delays formed a pattern that he, in his prudence, chose not to express aloud. Meanwhile, his dedication remained intact. He prepared every scene with a rigor that impressed those working by his side, studied the nuances of each character, and maintained a serenity that began to result disconcerting for some. His silence, initially interpreted as respect, soon began to be perceived as a withdrawal, a resistance to participate in the social architecture that sustains a large part of the industry's internal movement. People who previously praised his composure began to suggest in discreet conversations that perhaps his attitude revealed a lack of understanding of the game. Others insinuated that he kept his distance out of mistrust, creating a climate of suspicion that propagated with surprising speed. This process, although intangible in its origin, generated a type of tension that advanced without noise. On recording sets where he was previously received with warmth, he now perceived gazes that avoided lingering too long on his. Producers who used to send frequent messages began to limit themselves to strictly necessary communications. Even casual encounters acquired a nuance he could not quite decipher, as if his mere presence evoked questions that no one dared to formulate openly. Despite these signs, Manglong maintained his confidence that time would reveal the transient nature of those subtle changes. His philosophy was sustained by the idea that constant effort, even when it seemed to have no immediate return, ended up opening paths. It was a conviction that had guided his first steps and continued to give him stability. However, the structures surrounding him operated under other logics. The industry rarely tolerates ambiguity, and the lack of participation in certain social spaces was perceived as a gesture of dissonance. In a system where harmony is often understood as silent alignment, any deviation can acquire a disproportionate weight. The effects of that perception grew without announcement. It was a progressive erosion, almost imperceptible, which did not manifest in direct confrontations, but in the slow disappearance of opportunities and in the emergence of private comments reinforcing a narrative distant from reality. For the first time, his serenity began to work against him, that which for years had been his personal hallmark transformed into the center of interpretations he could not control. And without knowing it, he was entering the first phase of a crisis that would soon escape any predictable limit. In the midst of that silent climate, a close colleague asked him why he continued to reject invitations that many considered essential. Manglong, faithful to his style, responded with a calm voice that there existed places where the light was so intense that it ended up obscuring the essential. That phrase, apparently simple, contained the nucleus of the tension growing around him, the permanent struggle between preserving identity and adapting to a system that rewards complacency. And in that silent conflict, the destiny that would accompany him toward even more uncertain stages began to be outlined. What do you think of this? Comment amen below so we can continue with the unfinished stories. What seemed like a slight misalignment in Yu Menglong's trajectory transformed, with a speed as abrupt as it was inexplicable, into a current of suspicion that traversed social networks with disproportionate force. It all began with an anonymous post on a low-visibility forum, written with an ambiguous tone that did not accuse directly, but insinuated behaviors contrary to the serenity the public had learned to associate with him. The absence of proof did not prevent the insinuation from acquiring weight. In the contemporary digital ecosystem, repetition has more force than evidence, and ambiguity becomes fertile ground for any possible reading. In a matter of hours, that imprecise phrase ceased to be an isolated comment to become a ceaseless flow circulating through platforms with unsettling naturalness. Social networks, accustomed to emotional urgency, responded with the speed typical of the cycles of indignation that characterize the present day. Manglong's name rose to the trending lists before anyone close to him could understand what was happening. Curiosity transformed into suspicion, and suspicion, fed by repetition, transformed into a narrative that began to consolidate without opposition. Digital communities divided almost immediately. On one side, there were those who had followed his career from his first steps and defended his reserved character as a sign of coherence, humility, and professionalism. For them, the rumors lacked foundation and deserved nothing more than indifference. However, the other half of the stage was driven by the constant need to identify culprits in every emerging scandal. For that group, the lack of details was not an obstacle, but an incentive fueling speculation. The absence of proof ended up becoming, paradoxically, an argument reinforcing suspicion through the logic of a narrative void. Meanwhile, fragments of old interviews with Manglong reappeared insistently. Natural pauses, calm gazes, and silences typical of his temperament were extracted from their original context and reinterpreted as signs of coldness, emotional distance, or hidden arrogance. Visual manipulation became a powerful tool. Images were slowed down, brief gestures were cropped, backgrounds were darkened to create atmospheres suggesting behaviors that had no real basis. The narrative stopped seeking facts and moved on to construct a convenient fiction, reinforced by every user who shared the content without questioning it. Traditional media, attentive to the growth of the phenomenon, joined the conversation with speed. Entertainment programs dedicated entire segments to analyzing his behavior in past appearances. Columnists established comparisons between his case and that of other public figures whose reputations had deteriorated following similar rumors. Although none of those parallels had a concrete relation to Manglong, their mere mention reinforced the idea that he was part of a recurring pattern. In that process, his story ceased to be individual to become one more symbol within the media machinery that needs continually renewed narratives. In the midst of the growing storm, Manglong decided to maintain silence. There were no press releases, declarations, or attempts to deny the rumors. For some, that decision represented prudence and containment in a moment of high tension. For others, the lack of response was interpreted as a tacit confirmation. In the digital environment, silence is rarely perceived as a deliberate act. Rather, it becomes a space that each observer fills with their own conclusions. What had previously been admired as serenity began to be perceived in a distorted manner as a void demanding to be filled with outside interpretations. The professional consequences did not take long to manifest. Companies with which Manglong had collaborated for years began to review their strategies. Some paused advertising campaigns with the argument that they needed to evaluate possible reputational risks. Others, more cautious, opted to distance themselves without announcing it explicitly. On digital platforms, the algorithm acted with the same silent precision. The content in which he appeared decreased in visibility, reducing his public presence without the need for official decisions. It was a gradual but definitive withdrawal. In the internal part of the industry, the impact was even more evident. Casting directors stopped mentioning his name in planning meetings. Projects that previously considered him an ideal candidate eliminated his profile from lists without explanations. There was no formal veto, simply he ceased to be considered. What was occurring was a sophisticated process of silent exclusion that did not need public accusations. The industry, accustomed to protecting itself against any risk, retreated strategically. The most faithful followers tried to counteract the negative narrative. They created support campaigns, shared significant moments of his career, and wrote messages defending his integrity. However, their efforts were overcome by the magnitude of the phenomenon. The internet does not function by balance, but by volume, and the volume of suspicion had reached levels exceeding any emotional defense. The public conversation became a chaotic space where hypotheses, unverified theories, and hasty conclusions coexisted. When Manglong appeared in public during that period, his expression remained serene. That serenity, far from protecting him, began to be interpreted as a problematic trait. Some affirmed that that calm was a facade. Others assured that it represented indifference to media pressure. For those observing him with attention, however, there was a new nuance in his gaze, a deep weariness, a reflection of the silent struggle he was waging on a terrain where he had no tools to defend himself. The situation had acquired a dimension escaping his control, a rhythm dragging him toward an increasingly dark place. The media avalanche could no longer be stopped. It had transcended the initial rumor and transformed into a self-sufficient mechanism, fed by the constant need for new narratives. Manglong's case became a forceful example of the fragility of any public figure whose image depends on fluctuating perceptions. Everything that would come after was already inscribed in that moment: the speed with which collective certainties are built, the absence of nuances, and the capacity of the media environment to redefine a trajectory without the protagonist having the opportunity to intervene. The darkest stage in Yu Menglong's life began when the media noise, which once occupied every corner of his routine, ceased to resonate with the same intensity. What many would have interpreted as a relief became, for him, a strange silence, a pause that brought no rest, but a heavy stillness that settled into every gesture. When attention shifted toward new controversies, Manglong remained suspended in an intermediate space where he was no longer the center of the debate, but neither did he recover the stability that had characterized the first years of his career. It was like walking inside an echo that only he could hear, an echo magnifying every doubt and every shadow. Projects that had been planned months in advance disappeared without warning. Meetings that seemed assured were canceled with brief messages sent by assistants who barely knew him. Producers who previously insisted on collaborating avoided any direct contact. The calls that once marked the rhythm of his professional agenda were extinguished from one day to the next, substituted by a silence that became denser with every sunrise. For Manglong, that was not the passing effect of a rumor, but the silent validation that the system had decided to dispense with him without the need for public declarations. The people who visited him during that period described an atmosphere where there was no trace of rage or complaints. His voice remained calm, his manner respectful, but behind that habitual calm began to appear a new weariness, an imperceptible delay in his gaze, suggesting that the inner strength that had sustained him for years was starting to fracture. Even so, Manglong showed himself grateful for every word of support. He expressed no reproaches nor mentioned the decisions that had left him on the sidelines. He seemed rather an observer of his own decline, a witness trying to understand how a silence, which was once synonymous with serenity, had transformed into an argument to isolate him. In reserved conversations with those who formed part of his most intimate circle, Manglong let slip reflections he had kept hidden until then. He spoke of two types of fame, one that liberates and gives space to grow, and another that takes ownership of the one holding it until suffocating them. He did not say it with bitterness, but with a clarity revealing the depth of his analysis. He explained that fame, as he had lived it, ceased to be an opportunity to expand his art and had become a rigid structure conditioning every movement, every silence, every appearance. With the passing of days, the pressure became harder to bear. Manglong began to appear less and less in public spaces. His walks, previously brief escapes to order his thoughts, became slow and carefully measured. Followers who found him by chance described a figure that seemed to carry an invisible weight. The serenity that had defined him since the start of his career now mixed with a vulnerability he had never shown. It was evident he was in a silent struggle against forces not under his control. The most critical point arrived when the news of his death was disseminated. The speed with which it spread contrasted deeply with the silence that had marked his final months. Many reacted with disbelief, unable to reconcile the image of the serene artist with such a devastating outcome. Others revisited interviews, scenes, and old photographs in search of signs that might have gone unnoticed. The gazes that previously seemed tranquil now acquired a melancholic tonality. The silences interpreted as reflection were perceived as traces of a silent pain. Manglong's death not only rekindled interest in his career, but also opened a broader conversation about the fragility of public figures in an environment where perception can mold reality with unsettling ease. There was talk of the speed with which rumors go viral, of the lack of nuances in collective judgments, and of the emotional pressure falling on those living under constant exposure. His case became a mandatory reference to analyze how entertainment mechanisms, driven by informational speed, can corner an individual to invisible limits. As spontaneous tributes followed one another, debates also arose in specialized spaces. It was no longer asked what Manglong had done to provoke his fall, but what circumstances had allowed a recognized figure to end up isolated without anyone intervening. That change of focus, although late, offered a more complete form of recognition, an understanding arriving when he could no longer benefit from it. His story began to be resignified far from the scandal, acquiring emotional density and a human dimension that the media conversation rarely grants in real time. Those who went back to observe his work found nuances that took on a different meaning. In his interpretations, they saw vibrations of sensitivity that seemed to announce a silent inner struggle. His characters, previously admired for their depth, were now perceived as involuntary reflections of his own emotional state. The public understood that, behind every scene, existed a man whose serenity was simultaneously a gift and a weight. His legacy shifted from controversy toward a broader reflection on the need for empathy, collective responsibility, and the importance of questioning the immediate narrative. He left a mark inviting one to look beyond the surface, to recognize the humanity hidden behind the public image. And in the midst of that process of reinterpretation, an echo emerged that seemed to extend beyond his own story, an echo inviting a reconsideration of the way we observe, judge, and consume those who occupy the stage. And in that persistent echo, something deeper was revealed, that his story was only just beginning to be understood. With the passing of the months, the impact of the life and farewell of Yu Menglong began to settle in a quieter territory, far from the bustle that once defined his fall. Media attention, so volatile and changing, moved on to new stories, but what remained was a more intimate memory, built by those who found in his trajectory a mirror of sensitivity and coherence in an environment that rarely allows fragility. He was not spoken of to rekindle the scandal, but to reflect on the way his figure revealed deep tensions of the entertainment world, tensions that had remained hidden even when the light seemed to protect him. In different corners of the industry, a process of late introspection began. Producers who rarely thought about the emotional dimensions of the work mentioned the need to create spaces where performers could express weariness or doubts without fear of being discarded. Young actors found in his story a forceful reminder: visibility is an opportunity, but also a risk, demanding a strength not always possessed without support. His silent struggle became a starting point for debates on collective responsibility, the speed with which judgments are formed, and the suffocating pressure public scrutiny can impose. Those who reviewed his work from a new perspective discovered nuances that had previously gone unnoticed. In his gazes, they found vibrations of a deep sensitivity, as if every character had been a window into an inner life the public did not know how to see in real time. His interpretations acquired a different resonance, illuminated by the late understanding of his fragility. What was admirable was not solely his talent, but the way he maintained integrity, even when the structure surrounding him demanded silent obedience. From this process, his legacy was redefined with a different brilliance. It was no longer about the image of an artist wrapped in a scandal, but of a man who defended his personal coherence in a system that very rarely allows for nuances. The serenity he sustained until the end ceased to be interpreted as passivity and became a symbol of a deeply human dignity. His story, so marked by contrasts, opened a conversation transcending his own life and expanded toward broader questions about truth, empathy, and the limits of public exposure. The final reflection left by his trajectory resonates as a warning and, at the same time, as an invitation: the need to look with greater compassion at those who transit the stage of fame, to question the speed with which narratives are disseminated, and to recognize that behind every public figure exists a vulnerability that cannot always be expressed. The story of Yu Menglong is not reduced to a tragedy. It is a window into human fragility in an environment that idealizes images and forgets realities. His memory continues breathing in those who find in his journey a call to value authenticity, even when it presents itself silently. If you wish for us to delve into another story or explore a hidden chapter of the entertainment world, leave your question in the comments.